Vladimir Ulyanov's Lenin. He was the face of the Russian Revolution, the leader of the Bolsheviks, and for a time was the head of government of Soviet Russia and the Greater Soviet Union. And in that time he administered policies and acts fairly distinct from those of Stalin. Lenin served in office until his death in January of 1924 at the age of 53. Although he may have lived longer had it not been for an attempt on his life in 1918, which left rusting lead bullets lodged in his body for years. Although his declining health has also been attributed to the relatively recent discovery that Lenin may have been suffering from syphilis. Though regardless of the cause, Lenin soon became wheelchair-bound and gradually lost his grip on reality, as well as his abilities to move and speak. But what if Lenin's health didn't deteriorate so drastically, and instead lived to shape the development of the USSR to the project he envisioned it to be? First, let's get an idea of who Lenin was and what the government was like under his guidance. Lenin, like most Marxists it would seem, came from a fairly well-off family, however grew to become a very bitter young man following his father's death, an event which triggered him to renounce his religion and leave him drifting for a new purpose in life, finding meaning in revolutionary socialism and taboo left-wing philosophy. Following the execution of his brother, a Marxist extremist who had made an attempt on the Tsar's life and was thusly executed, Lenin didn't see it quite that way, however. To him, the Tsar had taken his brother, as he'd once believed God had taken his father. So too did he renounce the Tsar, and to avenge his brother, took up studying the same philosophy as he did, beginning in his mind an ideological and social crusade against the Tsar through writing and organization of protests, which would soon spawn the Bolsheviks as a splinter group to the Menshevik front. Of course, this means Lenin would find himself in trouble with the law on quite a few occasions, leading him to be exiled to Siberia for a short-term sentence, only to be exiled again in 1907. Now, during World War I, Germany saw an opportunity to stir up trouble in Russia following civil unrest and dissatisfaction with the Tsar, and so facilitated Lenin's transport back to Russia to lead the revolution, of course never intending for it to grow to the level it did. Following the revolution, Lenin quickly organized the Soviet government in the early days of 1917, changing the party name of the Bolsheviks from the Social Democratic Labor Party to the more straightforward Communist Party, an act which would have been followed by the expelling of the Mensheviks and rival revolutionary parties to essentially make Soviet Russia a one-party state. The executive branch of the Soviet government would be the Council of People's Commissars, of which Lenin was the head chairman, as well as the head of the Communist Party and its various functioning branches. So it's important to understand that since Soviet Russia was a one-party state, the Communist Party was something of a government within the government, and its policies would become the policies of the Soviet Union. The Communist Party had three primary departments, which were the Central Committee, a council for leadership to discuss issues, the Politburo, which was the policy-determining wing of the party, and the Org Bureau, which organized local and large-scale projects, as well as oversee the activities of regional governments. Lenin held a tight grip over all three and began nationalizing banks, railroads, farms, factories, mines, and land owned by the aristocracy and clergy. Lenin was a believer that nationalization should only apply to large-scale businesses and encouraged small enterprises by local governments, as well as small business owners to continue making money until they grew large enough to be nationalized. Resources like gold too would be collected by the new Soviet government to add to the National Reserve. This period would also see cracking down upon what Lenin deemed counter-revolutionary media, promising that it would only be temporary, but we all know how that went. Most of Lenin's policies abided by the promises of the Bolshevik decrees, providing a secular education for all Russian children, establishing orphanages, and limiting the workday to 8 hours. However, he'd also abolished the old legal system to be replaced by a vague law of revolutionary consciousness and a sense of socialist justice. Not exactly an ideal system for maintaining order, and to make matters worse, Lenin also abolished military ranking for the sake of egalitarianism, in order for soldiers to elect their commanders regardless of qualification. Lenin had also issued the Declaration of Rights of the People of Russia, allowing non-Russian ethnic groups to establish their own independent nations, later pushing for the appointment of communist leaders to these independent nations so they could be united into the USSR. Now, Lenin was often critiqued by other socialists for not implementing real socialism, most notably pointing to his demonstrable opposition to widespread democracy and not putting the means of production in the hands of the worker, but in the hands of the government to lend to the worker but take away if necessary. He'd appealed to the Central Powers for peace, a move many perceived as weak and cowardly, insisting he wage an internal revolution to spread across Europe, also cited as Lenin's poor economic stratagem and policy, which punished anybody who may have been doing slightly better than the rest, leading to the rise of a black market, which would in turn lead to the rise of the Czech police, who who would meet violations of Lenin's policies with extreme force, disappearing people en masse or sending them to prison camps. Overall, Lenin's initial rule may not seem that much better than Stalin's, but policies were distinct enough to lead the nation down a very different road. For instance, Lenin wanted to accumulate wealth for the USSR through a system of what he referred to as responsible capitalism, which was his allowing of small enterprise until it grew large enough to be nationalized. Stalin, on the other hand, believed that with enough force and direction, such wealth and industry could be achieved through the 5-year plan, which led to harsh labor conditions and famine initially, but eventually achieved the goals each 5-year plan had laid out: stabilization, reinforcement, militarization, etc. Lenin's plan would be more gradual, but risked what he believed would be a capitalist counter-revolution, so incentives would need to exist for business owners to want to rise high enough for their companies to be nationalized, or else there'd be a whole lot of disgruntled businessmen who would have felt the government had just stolen everything they worked for. This could be achieved by allocating more resources, food, and housing to the business owners, but this would inevitably create a slippery slope for an upper class thriving above those whose businesses haven't been nationalized, so no matter how you look at it, there's really no way of pleasing everybody in this situation. Also, Lenin, unlike Stalin, was an internationalist and believed that the revolution should spread across Europe and the globe. This ran opposite to Stalin's regime, which envisioned socialism thriving in one country and which would gradually convert neighboring countries by leading through example and unite them under one flag eventually. Now, aside from the political ambitions this ideal would entail, this means Lenin, again unlike Stalin, would be open to international trade as a means of acquiring more wealth for the Union, using controlled capitalism to quickly build and nationalize small businesses, while developing trade ties to the US and Britain. What could go wrong? In our timeline, the Soviet Union was able to thrive while many other nations struggled to get by in the Great Depression. This was largely due to the fact that nations like the USSR and Yugoslavia had economies grossly disconnected from the Western economic system, so when it collapsed, the two were safely out of the splash zone. This meant the Soviet Union became an attractive home for skilled workers seeking employment, helping the USSR modernize faster than it ever could. In this timeline, however, Lenin's international trade straps the Soviet economy into the car right before the crash, leading to mass poverty and starvation, as well as outrage from the business owners whose wealth had been stolen by the government, which now couldn't even feed them. A more totalitarian regime is enforced by Lenin to prevent his feared capitalist revolt, leading to more censorship, secret police, and destruction of freedom. But the Depression isn't all bad for Lenin. In fact, he sees it as a reassurance that capitalism is unsustainable and on its way out. Lenin's only mistake in his own eyes was that he used capitalism as a stepping stone for communism, leading him to double down on his beliefs, and sending his second-in-command Trotsky to begin fanning the flames of revolution across Europe, in Germany, in France, in Italy, and in Spain. Trotsky would make voyages across Europe to speak on behalf of and mobilize the communists of Europe into a frenzy against the capitalist systems which have left them in the poverty they now wallow in. The Soviet Union, in a rather poor display, would funnel resources into funding foreign revolutions instead of providing for its own people. Stalin, whom Lenin had always been wary of, would be exiled for conspiracy to subvert the Soviet government, leading Stalin to flee overseas to California, where he'd assumed the new name Joe Steele. Trotsky would instigate conflicts within every nation he'd visit. The revolution in Germany would be easily put down by the Freikorps, however in Spain and Italy the conflicts would be longer lasting. It'd be in France where Trotsky would have the most success, instigating a regime change with French Popular Front leader Léon Blum at its head. In Italy, a communist resistance group was heading a civil war against Mussolini's fascist government, while the Spanish Civil War was brought about early. Historically, the communist presence in Spain and Italy had coincidentally tended to concentrate along their shared border with France, meaning it'd be very easy in this timeline for the French Commune to supply communist forces in both nations, because by this point neither Germany nor the Soviet Union is capable of funding either side on a grand scale, as had happened with the Spanish Civil War in our timeline. The two civil wars in Italy and Spain end in stalemate, with communist-occupied lands breaking away and uniting with France into the European Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. Over in the US, Joe Steele would have become a member of Eugene Debs' Socialist Party, quickly rising through the ranks and following Debs' passing would take control of the party, leading it into a more radical direction and uniting it with Communist Party USA on the West Coast. He would draw in more disillusioned and impoverished Americans to support the party, soon earning it over 1 million members. Stalin, now Steele, knew he wouldn't be able to legally ascend to the office of presidency even with his phony citizenship papers, and so would plot an overthrow of the American government, seeing his opportunity to launch an opposition movement to the increasingly unpopular President Herbert Hoover. This move would be met with much anger by a large group of corporatists, who themselves would formulate their own plot to oust Stalin, using their own 1 million man army of veterans under the leadership of General Douglas MacArthur and Smedley Butler, lighting the flames of a second American Civil War. The industrial region of the US occupied by Stalin's forces would break off into the Foundry. New England, being cut off from the rest of the US, would secede and defend itself from the communists. Britain would distance itself from international conflicts, remaining relatively isolationist, yet financially supports the anti-communist forces, much the same way the US would support the Allies in World War II. Germany, Italy, Spain, the US, and Japan enter into an anti-Comintern alliance, agreeing to defend each other from further communist aggression, supplying the US and American corporatist forces with both weaponry and funds. By 1939, the US would reclaim the Foundry, seeing many corporatists take positions of power in the region, while the American government recuperated under the watch of General Douglas MacArthur, who would have initiated a period of martial law in the US. With the Foundry in tow, the US would begin manufacturing weapons for its anti-Comintern allies across the globe. The Soviets would not be in the best shape, as while Lenin managed to quash dissidents and regress to Stalinist tactics, he had failed to achieve the same industrial and military results which Stalin did. As a result, the Soviet economy would not be the only thing to lag behind the rest of Europe. Lenin's time in the spotlight had passed, and Trotsky would shift the hub of international communism from Moscow to Paris, where the nation's higher level of industry and population allowed the communist experiment to be more successful than what it had become in Lenin's Russia. The next few decades would become a continued ideological war for dominance across the globe, international communism spreading from its hubs in Eastern and Western Europe to South America, to Asia, and to Africa. And that is where I'll end this video for now. The US of Z thanks you for watching, support your legion by liking the video, or join our ranks by subscribing for more. Mr. Z, out.